The deaths and destroyed lives were not confined to the UK. Thousands fell victim to the infected blood scandal across Europe, America and Japan. What was different was how other countries responded, how authorities moved to investigate and in some cases prosecute the people and institutions to blame much, much earlier. In France, the former head of the country's blood transfusion service was jailed for 4 years in 1992 for knowingly distributing AIDS-infected blood products to patients. 7 years later, France's former Prime Minister, Laurent Fabius, was also charged with manslaughter, although later acquitted. In 1996, Japan's then Health Minister, Naoto Kan, tearfully apologised to victims of the scandal after personally exposing documents proving government culpability. Those affected were then offered some £350,000 in compensation. But even as the extent of the scandal was unfolding in the UK, the response was often one of denial and disregard. When the chief medical officer advised the British government in 1989 that it should compensate thousands of victims for what he called the unique catastrophe, the then Health Secretary Ken Clarke rejected the request because of the cost. Des Collins is a solicitor who's represented and advised around 1,500 victims and their families.
I think the government of the day in this country, this was just the end of the Maggie Thatcher era, which was a very different time from where we are now. The government of the day took one look across the channel and said, that's not going to happen here, so we'll cover it up. And they covered it up, and then having started covering it up, they just couldn't stop, because once you tell one lie, it leads to another, and that's what happened here.
That culture, the lack of understanding and empathy, still evident as key political players from this decades-long scandal gave evidence to the inquiry. The former Prime Minister, John Major, was forced to apologise after suggesting it had all just been bad luck.
There's no amount of compensation you can give that could actually compensate for what had happened to them. What had happened to them was incredibly bad luck, awful, and it was not something that anybody was unsympathetic to.
And Ken Clarke was accused of showing contempt to the inquiry when he gave evidence.
Why do we have to go in such meticulous detail through who said what when, and when did he change his mind? And I do seem to have changed my mind, yes. It didn't make any difference, did it?
I think
what happened on the ground?
Not for me to answer questions.
Well, it is. What's the relevance of all this? What difference did it make on the ground?
I think the relevance ultimately, Lord Clarke, is for me to determine.
In today's report, he was criticised for both his handling of the issue while he was Health Secretary, but also for what Sir Brian said was his disparaging attitudes towards the victims. Today, politicians of all persuasions are now acknowledging this has taken too long and promising justice. But that is the easy bit. Successive governments have been dragged kicking and screaming to this point, adding to the sense that these victims and their families don't matter enough. What they want now is a guarantee that this won't happen again. Well, earlier I spoke to the head of the inquiry, Sir Brian Langstaff, and began by asking him how this scandal could take place over so many decades and involve so many people, from doctors to civil servants.
I think it's a great mixture of things. I mean, take one example. Take a child who is 1 year old and is given a treatment, blood product, which he should never ever have had. 2.5 years later, his parents are told in a hospital corridor that their son has HIV. And as a result, because of the social culture at the time, family are shunned. AIDS dead, written on the wall. AIDS dead, scratched on the car. The father loses his job because his child has AIDS. They have to move house. And all the time, he and his wife are watching their child dwindle, waste away in front of their eyes until, frail, frightened, he dies at the age of 7. And then they're told that they had the best available treatment. So the strands to this, as you can see, are huge. The treatment that he's given and why it was bad to give that treatment in the light of what was known at the time. You've got the reaction of telling him in the hospital, which shows no respect for personal sensitivity, no respect for confidentiality. You have the way in which society as a whole behaved as a consequence, and you have the way in which what happened is then, it's not appreciated, not recognised as having been done anything wrong.
When you look back at the huge length of time that this has spanned, the huge suffering, people have died, people are still suffering now. What does it say about the way our systems have worked, how our political system in terms of responding honestly and openly to what has been a scandal?
One of my recommendations is a recommendation which is designed to improve the responsiveness of government. If that recommendation is implemented, then I believe that government will be better for it, and we will not have the same sort of incidents happening in the future as we had on this occasion. And if we want to avoid a future in which people, a lot of people from families across the UK go into hospital and come out with infections which are life-shattering, which they should not have had. If we can avoid that, then we can avoid the loss of trust which comes when people realise they've been betrayed by the government which is supposed to look after their safety, and the doctors who are supposed to look after their safety, and put that first. And if the government then recognises what has happened and doesn't compound the agony by saying things which simply aren't true and don't bear examination, then we will avoid something like this happening again. And that, after all, is the real value for the future of inquiries. They have a real value for illuminating the past, but they also have a real value for turning a searchlight onto the future, so that the future is better for all of us. And that's why it's a public inquiry in the public interest.
Sir Brian, thank you very much for talking to us today.